Hi again, and welcome to the second in my series where I try to dispel some of which I consider are myths in landscape photography. And what I want to do today is to consider the suggestion that critical focus and perfect sharpness are vital in landscape photographies. And just before we go any further, to support that suggestion, just start off with a couple of quotes. One from Ansel Adams, "There's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept." And one from British landscape photographer David Ward, "Nobody ever stood in front of an image and cried because it was sharp." So, is image sharpness overstated, and do you need critical focus and specifically the use of manual settings to achieve sharpness? Well, first of all, let's consider some aesthetic choices we might make in taking a landscape image. One of the common ones is to use misty conditions to simplify compositions in landscape photography. So here we are using mist to specifically soften some of the regions of an image. Other regions we may want to be sharp, but it does suggest that front to back critical sharpness isn't essential in every case. Similarly, for that sort of image, we may want to use negative clarity to reduce local contrast differences, to slightly soften the image. Another technique that's widely used in landscape photography is to use what's known as the Orton effect, to give a softening of an image to create a more so-called painterly scene. And finally, for most extreme example, probably is intentional camera movement to soften and blur the image. So there are lots of cases where critical sharpness isn't essential, and we've made aesthetic decisions to achieve that. But before we go any further, let's just highlight the difference between focus and sharpness. They tend to be used interchangeably, but they're not actually the same. So if we look at an image and say it's pin sharp or tack sharp, we're tending to be concentrating on focus, and pin and tack suggest that the lens has been perfectly focused so that all the light is hitting the sensor as a pinprick or a tack print rather than as a wider blob. So that's critical focus, and that really is a scientific concept. In the real world, we don't get perfect focus across the width. Our lenses aren't perfect, our sensor may not be perfectly flat, but in real world circumstances, the relationship of the size of the blob of light to the size of the sensing element is such that we don't see that. So that's the science. Then we get to the engineering, and that is really considering the concept of acceptable focus. An acceptable focus relates to depth of field. How far into our image can we see where the focus is perceived to be tack sharp? It may not be tack sharp, but within the engineering constraints of the sensor and the lens design and our ability to view it, it appears to be tack sharp, and that's known as depth of field. And so what we're looking at is the closest point to the camera that is acceptably sharp to the furthest point. And that's really where I have a problem with the suggestion that is quite common, particularly among the less experienced YouTube content creators, that critical focus is important. Because if you look at the real world and the constraints on depth of field, we're really talking about aperture. And while this varies from camera sensor type to camera sensor type, if we start off with APS-C as probably one of the most common, then what we're talking about is we can stop the lens down to about f11 before diffraction effects start to visibly degrade our image quality. I don't want to go into diffraction, it's well described in lots of other sources. But within those constraints, if we set the aperture at f11 and we go to let's say an app or a website where we can calculate depth of field, what you'll find is that for an APS-C camera at f11, if you focus maybe 10 meters from the camera, pretty well everything from 5 meters, maybe less, right out to infinity will be in focus. So to some extent, if we focus anywhere between 10 meters and infinity, it isn't going to make a great deal of difference to the perception of the image in terms of its focus. So it's very easy to overstate the importance of critical focus in landscape photography, assuming you are going for front to back focus. Now, the term front to back is a little bit misleading. I think for most people, under most conditions, excuse me, f11 will give us pretty good depth of focus from, say, maybe 3-5 meters out to infinity. If we want things to be pretty much sharp at our feet, then either we have to use tilt shift lenses or we will have to focus stack, in which case we may need to be a little bit more concerned about the exact points of focus for the images that we're going to stack that cover the closest range to the camera. Under normal circumstances, and certainly when you're starting out, critical focus really isn't that critical. I went on a workshop run by Charlie Waite, the famous UK landscape photographer, 7 or 8 years ago now, and one of the delegates said to Charlie, "Where should I focus to get optimal depth of field?" And his answer was a third of the way into the scene. Now, measuring a third of the way into the scene can be difficult, and some people advocate simply focusing at infinity. In most cases, unless you've got things really close to you, that will be good enough. So the point of making this video is really, if you're starting out and you're looking for advice, don't get too hung up about using manual focus, critically assessing that with live view and mirrorless cameras. It really isn't that necessary. Now, having talked about focus, let's talk a little bit about sharpness. And sharpness is really a superset of focus. Focus is part of sharpness, but it's not the whole story. Sharpness is how we perceive the effectiveness of focus of an image. And it's going to depend on a lot of factors other than the engineering considerations of the lens and depth of field. It's also going to depend on the media that we view the image on, whether it's a print, the type of paper we print onto, whether it's a screen, what the screen resolution is. So when we're talking about sharpness, we're also considering things like the clarity setting that we use in our post-processing, and also the focusing, the sharpening settings we use. Now, all of these techniques are aimed at modifying local contrast to some extent. So we perceive edges that have a high degree of contrast as being sharp. That isn't to say that we can use sharpness to compensate for an image that's really poorly focused, but we can change the perception of the image by the sharpening settings we use in post-processing. And as I said before, we don't necessarily have to make things sharper. We can use negative clarity to make things softer if that's aesthetically what we're looking to achieve. So I hope this helps in just giving you some handle on what we mean by focus and what we mean by sharpness. And I'm not gone into any depth because those concepts are covered in enormous detail in a whole range of material on the web. But I think it's important to consider not just the technical basis, but actually the implications of these things in terms of the quality of the image that you get, and in terms of the effort that it is required to get the focus exactly as you want it. Because if you spend time on critical focus rather than time on looking for a better subject to photograph, then you're into the Ansel Adam quote, and you're possibly taking a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. So I hope you find this interesting. I hope it provides a slightly different way of looking at things. I'll finish off by just giving an example with one camera that I've got. I don't use it often, but this is a slightly oddball camera. This is a Sigma DP1 Merrill, and it's slightly oddball because it uses a Foveon sensor rather than a Bayer sensor, and if you're interested you can look that up. The thing about Foveon sensors are they operate very poorly at high ISO, so you're limited pretty much to base ISO. And this camera, using the foveal sensor, is actually capable of producing very high definition images. It's generally regarded to be something between 30 and 40 megapixels. In its day, it was pretty much pushing the boundaries of medium format. And so the reviews of this camera that you can read will show that it gives superb image quality, but the user interface is appalling. It's got a very low resolution screen, it's got no viewfinder, it's got very few focus aids, but all of that doesn't matter. This format, this camera has an APS-C format sensor, so I use this camera purely as point and shoot mode at f11, almost always on a tripod, because it's high ISO, is very limited, and so my shutter speeds constraints are quite high. But although this is the camera that is capable of giving the highest quality of images of any that I've got, I never focus it. What do I mean by that? I set the focus on the back, pointing the camera at the floor. I don't need to be looking at it. I set the focus point to be 5 meters in front of the camera, and that is it. Then I'm done. And I put the camera on a tripod, set the aperture to f11, aperture priority, timer release, and the camera picks the shutter speed. And that works perfectly with this camera. No focusing at all, let alone critical focusing. So don't get too hung up about critical focusing until you're really getting into extreme front to back depth of field. Because really, most of the time, all it's going to do is slow you down, confuse you, and get in the way of you taking pictures and giving you the opportunity to critically review your work as it progresses. So I hope you've enjoyed this, hope you found it useful, and thanks once again for watching. Goodbye.